Um, before reading, I'll set this here. So I didn't have much of an opportunity to go over what the Vespers were going to be like tonight, and I find it rather interesting that I think the content of what we've prayed, and actually the last few weeks has been this way, coincidentally, it seems, has been very much related to the content of what we're going to be going over from St. Francis de Sales. Yeah, so this is our last session. On the one hand, this has really kind of been a wonderful journey, kind of going through this way of devotion, with all of you. And I feel like we should just have, we haven't even begun to, get into the depths. We're barely scratching the surface of what's here. But I hope, at the very least, in your own reading, as well as what we've been going over, St. Francis has been able to, the Lord has been able to show you through St. Francis and what he's given us, some ways to grow in a deeper relationship with him. Now, in the last two sessions we covered part 3, moving on to part 4. And in the first 3 parts is really what I would call kind of sort of the positive aspects of this. Part 4, you could in a certain sense call it the negative, because we're getting into here some of the challenges that we're going to encounter, particularly the temptations as we continue to walk this way. And so he starts off first with, I think, a really good warning, that we must not give heed to what the world will say, because as we begin to live, as we begin to, walk in this way of, purifying our souls, of from our attachments to sin, and from even committing sins, and as we deepen our prayer life and our approach to the sacraments, we start to engage in mental prayer. We begin to live lives of virtue and building up these virtues in our lives. What we're going to express to the world that we see out there is going to be different than what it has been before. And I'm sure all of us in this room, to some degree, have experienced this somewhat already. And we'll start living in this different way. And I know I've run into this before. I had actually, as I was reading through this just this last week, I had a memory of a friend of mine. I think I was just out of high school, so I was about 18 years old, and I'd had this friend who was my best friend since middle school. And he was Jewish, and I was a Protestant Christian at the time, just didn't know anything else. And I was really starting to find the Lord. The Lord started really drawing my heart, and I started getting really involved in the church community that I was a part of. And I was starting to go to lots of different things, and we were talking. I was like, yeah, sorry, I got to go. I can't hang out right now because, I got to go to this church meeting. He's like, hey, John. He called me John. I don't know why. That's not my name. He said, just be careful with this. You have a tendency to kind of jump into stuff, and you can kind of burn out. And I remember telling him, I'm not going to burn out on this. And here I am 20 years later, and I haven't burned out. I've only grown in fervency. But he saw something different, and he was starting to worry about it. But it'll go even further than that, though. As Jesus tells us in John 15:19, it says, if you were of the world would love its own, because the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. The first thing that we may encounter as we begin to live a holy life is oftentimes the people around us will start to wonder, what's going on? Why are you this way? Why are you starting to, you're starting to, do all of these things, and that can be fun. And they called Jesus a glutton. They said that John the Baptist, because he didn't eat, the things that everyone else ate, that he had a devil. And so the world hates God. The world hates Jesus. And in this life of devotion, right, is our hearts being enveloped by divine love and living in this way and living in charity in such a way that it becomes this habitual way of, living out the life of God. The world's going to hate it. And we are going to experience hatred. It's going to be called excessive. It's going to be called extreme, unsustainable, and I think perhaps one of the things that we will encounter in the particular the age that we live in is also, it'll be called bigoted, because it's not accepting of every idea that's out there. And so, this is something to be aware of. It's not something to be discouraged by. It's something that should be expected. I think many of us probably have, at this point, considering the parish that we're at, and the fact that we're even here, have surrounded ourselves in many ways as much as we can with people who are holy and who are seeking a similar life of being united with Jesus. But it's still out there. We still have to encounter with the world. Another thing that we're going to begin to encounter, if we haven't already, is as we draw closer to the Lord, the one thing, well, we have to remember that there's an enemy, right? And the one thing that the enemy does not want is for us to draw closer to the Lord. He hates it, because that means that there is one person less that he will suffer in hell with at the end of time. And he wants as many people as possible to be there. And so the devil will begin to assault us. If he hasn't already, the assaults will begin, and as we draw closer and closer, and we begin to pour our hearts into that, we'll begin to start experiencing a sort of almost a spiritual warfare. And the way that the devil will attack is, and this is the way that everyone experiences, it's the ordinary means of diabolical attack. It's called temptation. And I know we've all experienced it because we're all sinners in this room. And even Jesus himself, right? He experienced temptation. He allowed the devil to tempt him in the desert. An interesting thing, too, about temptation, though, is that it's not always just from the devil, right? Sometimes the devil can just sit back and watch as we let our own concupiscence and our own lusts of our heart and our own failures take care of the job for him. There's actually an old, I forget which saint it was. I ran across this earlier, just today, actually. But he was talking about how the saint had kind of a vision of what was going on. And he was in Egypt, Alexandria. And it said that he saw the devil sitting tranquilly before the gates of Alexandria, while all of his emissaries were going out and attacking all of the hermits in the desert, because at the time there were many, desert hermits, desert fathers. The devil didn't have to do anything in the city of Alexandria, because it was this, he's like, I'll just let them take care of themselves. But those desert fathers, who were the ones who were out there, who were trying to become holy men and trying to draw close to the Lord, they were the ones who were under attack. And so we will come under assault. You may have already begun to experience it if you're starting to grow closer to devotion. If you, as you prepare for your general confession, if you haven't already made that, you will find distractions and things that will try to push you away and keep you from doing that. Difficulties will arise. And then you'll also go, and there will just be temptations to sins, perhaps things that you had thought fully, had been conquered years ago might come propping up. And so, but St. Francis gives this beautiful encouragement to those who are tempted. I thought this was beautiful, and I read it several times just going, wow. But he says, such terrific assaults, such mighty temptations, God never permits, except in the case of souls whom he designs to elevate to a particularly pure and excellent love. He also says then that even though God desires to elevate such people, not everyone who goes under these makes it through, and actually sometimes they succumb, so we need to be on our guard. And so then he goes over temptation, and he talks about it. Now, some of this, I think, I don't know if anyone in this room suffers in any way from scrupulosity at all, but I think some of this will actually be quite encouraging if you do have a tendency toward, worrying about, every little thing that you've ever done. He talks about there's 3 degrees by which we fall into sin, and these are temptation, which is by which the thoughts and ideas come to us. There is delectation, or taking delight in, right? It's where we take pleasure or delight in the thought. And then consent, which is where we actually commit whatever the sin might be. Now, What's interesting, and is very important to remember, is that temptation is not a sin. If you are tempted, you have not committed a sin. And actually, this is an area where the great heretic Martin Luther fell. Is he was incredibly scrupulous, and so he would go to his confessor after he had stubbed his toe and thought about saying a coarse word when he did, but he didn't actually do it. He was tempted to, he didn't. And then he would go to his confessor, and then he would say, I was tempted to sin. And it's because of this scrupulosity that he came to the conclusion that he didn't believe that he could be saved by the sacraments, and so he started moving on to this salvation by faith alone and all of that sort of thing. And so he missed this crucial point. He could have used St. Francis de Sales' advice, who coincidentally, St. Francis de Sales is one of the counter-reformers who came after him to counter those heresies, that temptation is not a sin by itself unless we invite it, unless we invite the temptation, which I'll get to that in a moment. And then the next step, the delectation, or the taking pleasure in the sin. St. Francis, when he gets to that, he starts talking about how we have actually kind of two natures within us. There's an inferior, he calls nature, and a superior nature. And the inferior does not always listen to the superior. And this is what it talks about in like Galatians 5, where St. Paul talks about the flesh lusts against the spirit, right? Or if you read Romans chapter 7, how Paul, I can't even relate how he says, the thing that I wish to do, I don't do, but the thing that I don't wish to do, I end up doing because of this. And he's, and that it eventually brings to the, oh, wretched man that I am, who will save me from this? It's one of my favorite verses, and now I can't remember it. But anyway, but these two natures are kind of war within us, right? We have this inferior sort of nature that's kind of base, and then the superior one, which is where our conscience in the Lord is kind of moving in our hearts. He gives a couple of illustrations about how this sort of thing works. He gives one of St. Catherine of Siena, which I won't go into too much detail. That one is actually only about a page, so I'll let you read that for yourselves. But he gives this very interesting example, and he goes through how temptation and affection can become a sin. So he gives the example of a princess. And so, remember, we're working in a time of kings and queens and such. But so there's a princess. And she's a young, beautiful princess, and she's married to a good prince, right? But because she's young and beautiful, there are many suitors who like to come and see, to try to tempt her. Those suitors coming and delivering their letters, or however they try to do that, those are very much like the temptations, right? There's nothing she can do about it. She receives a poem from Duke Othon over in Normandy, right? Well, she received a letter. It's an invitation to it. And the question is, what does she do with that letter? Does she take it and go, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm perfectly happy with my husband, right? And throw it away? Or does she go, well, isn't that nice? Right? Suddenly she's starting to entertain this thought, right? She's starting to take pleasure in the idea. Now, sometimes temptations will come to us, and because of our own affections, our own desires, our own histories, we might immediately start moving sort of into this, taking pleasure in the idea of the sin before we perhaps taken captive the thought right away. When that happens, it's likely that we have venially sinned. He says it's a light venial sin. But when we voluntarily choose to entertain the thought, right, and we voluntarily decide to, I like this idea, that's when we begin to sin grievously, because in our hearts we've already given ourselves over to it, whether we actually consent to whatever the act is or not, right? And so whether or not this princess decides to actually take these men up in their invitations, her taking delight in it can be a problem in and of itself. In addition, too, since she loves to kind of get these letters and she likes to take these things, she might start behaving or dressing in a manner in which she'll receive more of it, right? And that's when the temptation, she's inviting the temptation, right? And that's when the temptation becomes a sin in of itself, because she has brought the temptation to herself by drawing other people to want to pursue her, who is a married, woman. Then she's drawing it to herself, right? And so there are many ways in our own lives in which we can do this, right? I think we can probably think of our own sort of ideas, and we start, hey, maybe I'm going to invite some of these things. Perhaps it's in watching particular types of programs on television or things, movies, exposing ourselves to certain things. I think, remember I gave an example a few weeks ago of a game that the Lord had kind of inspired me to step away from that I enjoyed. And I think that was one of those where it would have been inviting temptation. Yes, and so, so we do have to be careful, and we have to be on guard on these things. And so, but the key, and this comes up in the example that he gives of St. Catherine of Siena, is what do we do with the temptation when it comes, right? And so, what he says is, he gives a great example. He's like, he actually asks, what do you do when the great temptation comes? And he says, well, be like a child who out on the plains sees a wolf or a bear. What does the child do? He's probably going to flee to his father or mother, right? And so we too, in like manner, should flee to our loving Father. We should flee to God. We turn away from whatever the thing is, right? And we turn to God. Now, this does not mean that we start going, okay, all right, I need to combat this thing, and all right, so okay, God, this thing, I'm being tempted by this thing right now, and I need to really, work, and let's fight it. Because what you're doing then is you're actually not so much looking to the Lord. You're looking at the sin, and you're trying to fight it yourself. You need to look at the Lord. Who is the Lord? He's the one who suffered and died for you. He's the one that's on the cross, right? That's why it can be good to carry with you a rosary. Because at the end of your rosary is a crucifix, right? And at the end, you can look at the crucifix. You can say, wow, this is my Lord. This is what he did for me. How wonderful is that? Gosh, he must love me. Suddenly, you're not engaging with the sin anymore. You're engaging with the Lord, right? That's one of the things that St. Francis says that you do not want to do, is you do not want to contest or dispute with the devil, because that's what's happening at that point. Which you don't want to converse with the enemy. There is only one answer that there is for the enemy. There's one thing that gets said to him, and we quote our Lord, which is, "Begone, Satan." There's a portion in here I would like to read to you that covers this point well. He does it, as usual, far better than I could ever describe. He says, "Do not dispute with the enemy, and give him no answer save one, that with which our blessed Lord answered and confounded him. Begone, Satan, for it is written, the Lord thy God shalt thou adore, and him only shalt thou serve. And just as a faithful wife will neither look at nor hearken to him that would lead her astray, but hastily places her heart under her husband's protection, and without parleying with danger, renews her vows of fidelity to him, so the devout soul, when she is assailed with temptation, must not dally with it by dispute or answer, but simply turn to Jesus Christ her spouse, and renew her protestations of faithfulness to him, and that she will be ever solely his." The answer in all of this is Jesus. He's the solution. Like, the whole point of all of this, right, is to draw closer to him and to come to him, and the devil hates it. But the answer to the devil coming and trying to break you away is to just draw closer once again. And sometimes temptation will come, and it will be terrible. Again, I'm sure many of us have experienced temptation, and perhaps we've resisted. And at the end of it, it seems like I feel like I'm dead. Perhaps you even consented to some degree of it, but you take no delight in it. You're fighting it. And it's like, Lord, I can't do this anymore, right? I just fallen. But we have remedies, right? We can come to him, right? And of course, we have the sacrament of confession, where we can confess even these things. Obviously, if it's just temptation, we can admit, it's like, look, this is a thing that I've been struggling with. Because the point of confession is not just to deal with our sins, but also to give us grace to be able to combat them in the future and to turn to the Lord, right? We have the Eucharist. My goodness. That's Jesus himself. That's Jesus. His entire body, blood, soul, and divinity, there to strengthen us, to encourage us, to empower us. Yeah, and so when you feel like you're beaten down, perhaps when you've fallen, when you feel like you can't go on, when perhaps you start to think, this is just too hard. Maybe I can't do this. Jesus may love me, but I don't know if I really love him. If you just have this little bit of something of like, maybe I should. It's like a fire that has had cinders poured on top of it, and 10, 12 hours later you go back to it and it seems like there's nothing there. But somewhere in there, if you look enough, there's this one burning coal. That means that the fire has not died. And that fire can be, or that little coal can ignite the fire in our souls again just by going to that one little moment. And so never give up in that. Never surrender to what is, wow, I think I almost quoted a movie. Whoops. Never give up, never surrender. But it's true, right? As long as there's just the littlest bit of hope, a little bit of fire left, we can fan that fire into flame. There's a lot more in part 4, but we have 2 parts to cover. So again, I'm going to encourage you to go through it yourself. He gives a lot more about resisting temptations, a lot of more remedies, lots of things about these two. He even gets into anxiety and sadness, which unfortunately I don't think we have time to look at ourselves. But I know that his words will be better than mine. So I'll let you go directly to the saint on that one. In the 5th part, I'll cover this very briefly. Part 5 of this book is really a reminder to us that this isn't just simply one book that we go through, right? But it's a way that he's laid out for us, which he introduces to us. It's a way of living, it's his way of being, it's a way of having life. And in order to continue to live this, it's good and even needed to once a year to go back and to examine our souls, to examine our affections, where we've been at, and to see where we are. See if maybe perhaps some of these affections that we kind of purified our hearts of, at the beginning of this, started maybe coming back up. Or perhaps we found that the Lord has really brought us forward and he's kept these things away. He gives us several meditations, just like he does in the first part again, to kind of go over these things and to start the process once again. Because remember, this isn't just a book that you pick up and you read through it and then you put down. This book, in a lot of ways, should become a friend to you. The seminarians, when they first get into the seminary and they get their breviary and they start praying the Liturgy of the Hours, one of my seminarian friends told me, picked it up, I was like, yeah, this is my girlfriend, is his breviary. And I think this book can be very much that way for us too, a close friend where we walk with St. Francis and we allow him to continue to instruct us and to keep going back and to continue walking in this beautiful way. And that's really the entirety of the 5th part. And so, I'll let you, as time goes on, really get into that, dive into it, and allow the Lord to continue to work in your hearts in that way. There was one thing about that. He said that traditionally, in the early church, the Christians would kind of renew their affections on the feast of the baptism of the Lord. And so if you would like a particular date, perhaps that's a good one to pick to begin to do that. Now, since it's our last session, I wanted to encourage just kind of on 2 points that do not actually come from St. Francis de Sales, but I think will help in taking what we've gained from him and taking it forward into our lives a little bit. One of them is an old Latin maxim, you could say. Exactly where it came from and who originated it, I think has kind of been lost to time immemorial. But the Latin phrase is lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. It's usually applied to liturgy, and what it means is the law of prayer forms the law of belief, forms the law of life, of the law of living, the way we live. And liturgically, I think we can see this, if you I think most of us, come to Holy Family for a reason, right? Liturgy is well respected here, right? We try to give great level of solemnity to the worship they've had. If we look at other parishes that are perhaps a little bit less diligent about that, sometimes begin to stray in the way that they seem to believe even, right? And so that's just an example. But I think this can be applied to more than just liturgy. I think it can be applied to our lives too. And so, what we've been encouraged over the last few weeks is draw close to the Lord. One of the things in particular that he stresses repeatedly is mental prayer. He keeps bringing it up. And actually at the very end of the book, he has a chapter about a portion of a couple of objections that people could raise to his work. And he talks about one is like, well, what if someone doesn't have the gift of mental prayer? And he said, basically, well, I think that that's incredibly rare. We just don't apply ourselves, so you can do it. And if there is the rare case where you have someone who really doesn't have that gift, then that can be overcome with the help of a good guide, which, by the way, that's one thing I forgot to bring up again, is back in the first part, chapter 4. He encourages us to have essentially a spiritual director to help us go through this. I strongly want to recommend that you go back, you read that chapter, and if you do not have a spiritual director, to do your best to find one. It can be hard. There are a lot of priests who are very, very busy, but to have a spiritual director to walk us through this so that we can stay faithful and, really to kind of clarify things that are difficult for us. To see through the fog, we can sometimes get caught up in our own emotions as we're trying to do this, or confused about which way should we go, what should I do, I don't know how to deal with this particular thing, and these guides that we can have in our lives can be very helpful to us. I am currently in the need of finding a spiritual director, but I did have one at one point. It was really more of just I had access to my pastor, and my goodness, it was so helpful. I still benefit from what I had from him at that time. But so, going back to lex orandi, lex credendi, if we approach the Lord in prayer like he is close to us, as St. Francis de Sales encourages us, like in mental prayer, we'll come to actually believe this truth, that he is close to us, because we're going to encounter him in one way or another. Exactly what that looks like will vary from person to person. And then if we come to believe that he is close to us, because we're encountering him and praying in that way, then we're going to live like he is close. And I think all of us would say that if we had Jesus standing right here all the time with us, physically, we would probably all behave in a very different way than we do normally. The fact of the matter is, though, that Jesus isn't just standing here with us. He actually dwells inside of us. He is with us. And so as we pray like he is close, that he's within us, we'll begin to believe it, and we'll begin to live like it. And then the last thing I would like to encourage you on is, these lecture series about twice a year have been done here at this parish for a long time. But the small group component that we've kind of incorporated here, particularly with specific small groups in that, is part of an initiative that was asked for by our local pastor and our shepherd, Archbishop Hebda. And his goal was that every Catholic would be in a small group through Lent. But I also know that the reason that he wanted to do this wasn't just so that people would be in small groups in Lent, but it was actually to make the church become smaller in a lot of ways. In this archdiocese, and some parishes in particular, actually the last parish I used to work at had 3,000 families. And you go to Mass on Sunday and you wouldn't know half the people there because there's 3,000 families. And if you do the math, it's between 12 and 15,000 people. It's massive. But these small groups, even though we're a much smaller parish than that, give us community. They draw us closer to have people that we're walking in faith with. And the questions that were designed specifically with the intention that they wouldn't just be regurgitating, whatever it was that we said in the talk, but that they would give us a moment to pause, to reflect, and then to also be vulnerable, with each other, to grow in a relationship with one another. And you can be the judge of whether or not that was successful. You can also, if you feel like it, tell me whether it was or not, because I wrote those questions. But what I want to encourage you to do is to don't let these small groups go, especially if you've been building relationships with people. Don't let it go. Don't let it just be something that was for Lent. Exchange your contact information and continue to meet. You'll have to readjust probably exactly where you do it and how you do it, and maybe exactly who's there will adjust a little bit. Change your format and your time as you need it, but don't let it simply be something that's for Lent. This is something that we all need for our spiritual lives to go on. We cannot do this alone. We can't do it simply in our families. Perhaps some of us have other groups and friends that we can turn to as well. But the relationships that you've formed over these last few weeks are valuable and they're beautiful, and you should not let it pass you by. This wasn't by chance that you ended up in these groups. The Lord orchestrated it. I could see it even there's a group 1 over here. Group 3 just disintegrated and then became part of group 1 with other people. Like, the Lord did that. That wasn't something that was designed by anyone else other than him. He orchestrated who came and who didn't come and all of that for that purpose, so that that group would get together. And he did that with all of these other groups too. So be faithful to what the Lord has done there and keep that going. I think I've gone over my time now, so I think we're going to end and move to our small groups.